Hello and welcome to my new channel in which I want to discuss various theological questions and themes and issues. I am still looking for a name for this channel, so you can leave your suggestions in the comments section below. My name is Tomislav Jakovic and I would like to address the question of spiritual beings called cherubim today. Now, some modern theologians are still so caught up in post-Enlightenment rationalism that they deny the very existence of spiritual beings altogether. That is especially prevalent here in Germany. A recent example would be Dieter Heidmann. On the other hand, there are others that are so hyper-excited about spiritual beings that they may even seek out these spiritual beings or want to have a relationship with them. I would like to avoid both of these extremes. Jesus took their existence for granted. So do I. But the Bible makes it very clear that they are created beings. And therefore, we are not to worship them. We are to worship God alone. And we are to seek God out for relationship. So, with this in mind, let's turn to the cherubim. The cherubim. Indeed, they play an extraordinary role in God's invisible realm as we encounter it in the Old Testament. The cherubim are the most frequently occurring spiritual being in the Old Testament next to only Yahweh himself. We find them 91 times in the Old Testament. And therefore we will focus today on the Old Testament. Of course, we remind ourselves that the New Testament is taking the Old Testament as its foundation. And the Old Testament has, in general, more to teach and more to tell about the spiritual realm and particularly about the cherubim. But we also want to remember that there are certain limitations we will face in our understanding of its message, as the Old Testament is far removed from us in time and in its conceptual thought and in its cultural environment and language. So with this in mind, let's turn to the cherubim. We want to look at two aspects in particular. First, we want to look at their name. And then secondly, we will look at their function. So name and function is what we're going to focus on today. Let's start with their name. What does it mean? Now, cherub is the singular in Hebrew, and cherubim is the plural. What does it mean though? In the 3rd century, there was a Jewish rabbi, Abahu, who suggested that it actually should be translated and means like youth. So he concluded that the cherubim had a youthful human appearance. This was a very influential idea in church history. It was picked up. And from this idea developed those cute, chubby little angels that became very popular in Europe in the 17th century. They are supposed to be actual representations of the cherubim, but they couldn't be further away from the actual biblical representation. These cute little angels may be where we got the popular idea from to call our cute little ones angels, which is, of course, theologically highly questionable. But it's okay, I get it. In the Bible, however, cherubim are never represented anything like these cute, chubby infants. Indeed, the translation of cherubim as like youth has been unanimously rejected by experts. Alternatively, the British scholar Alice Woods, recently in his dissertation on the cherubim, derived the word from an Akkadian word, karabu, which translates as to pray, to consecrate, or bless. This meaning then points to their function as those spiritual beings who guard the holy presence of God. and they guard it from the mundane or the profane. Thus, the cherubim are located at the demarcation between God's complete holiness and the rest of the invisible and visible creation. And the term cherubim, therefore, is less of a personal name and more a functional description. So let's turn to the Bible. We will look at Ezekiel chapter 1 and be reading from verse 4 till verse 11. As I looked, behold, a storm wind was coming from the north, a great cloud with fire, flashing forth continually, and a bright light around it, and in its midst something like glowing metal in the midst of the fire. Within it there were figures resembling 4 living beings, and this was their appearance. They had human form. Each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and their feet were like a calf's hoof, and they gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, were human hands. As for the faces and the wings of the 4 of them, their wings touched one another. Their faces did not turn when they moved. Each went straight forward. As for the form of their faces, each had the face of a man. All 4 had the face of a lion on the right, and the face of a bull on the left. And all 4 had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above. Each had 2 touching another being, and 2 covering their bodies. So far I'd like to read for now. Now Woods and others explain the 4 faces as representative of the 4 spheres of divine kingship. God rules over humanity, represented by the human face. The wild animals represented by the face of the lion. The domesticated animals represented by the face of the ox, and all that flies represented by the eagle. The point then is that much of this language is symbolic. We do not get a presentation of the actual look of the cherubim as much as we get a visual representation of their function and message. This idea is further strengthened in that the description of the cherubim is not consistent in the Old Testament. For example, if we turn to Ezekiel chapter 10, the prophet encounters the cherubim in another vision, and he identifies these beings with those he had described in chapter 1. But in Ezekiel 10:14 we read, "And each one had 4 faces. The first face was the face of a cherub. The second face was the face of a man. The third, the face of a lion. And the fourth, the face of an eagle." Thus, the ox is missing in this description. And also the order is changed up a little bit because of that. So instead of the ox, we find the enigmatic description of the cherub looking like a cherub, which doesn't really help us much if we do not know what a cherub looked like. Finally, we should keep in mind that the cherubim are spiritual beings. They are thus by nature explicitly not material, but immaterial beings. The 1st century Jewish historian Josephus might have been onto something when he stated, "But nobody can tell or even conjecture what was the shape of these cherubim." Now I would like to turn to a few more verses in the Bible that describe more their function. Let's first turn to Genesis 3, verse 24. "So he drove the man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he stationed the cherubim and the flaming sword which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life." So here we see the cherubim together with the flaming sword. It seems like they are wielding that flaming sword. And their purpose is to protect the presence of God in the garden. The very presence of God. Remember that that is a far cry away from those cute chubby little boyish angels that we see in modern times in European churches. There is another function that they have though. They occur a good number of times in the Old Testament as what we may call divine chauffeurs. Let's turn to 2 Samuel 22 verse 11. And he rode on a cherub and flew, and he appeared on the wings of the wind. And there's another passage that describes something very similar, or there are a couple others. Let's go back to Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 20, where you read, "These are the living beings that I saw beneath the God of Israel by the river Chebar. So I knew that they were cherubim." And one more, Psalm 99, verse 1, we read, "The Lord reigns, that the peoples tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim. Let the earth shake." So we get here this image of God who is enthroned above the cherubim. And they are like his escort. In the ancient world, they were to carry the king as he goes forth. So they both protect and guard, and they accompany him. Now, there is one other seer we need to talk about. The cherubim actually most frequently occur in the Old Testament in connection with descriptions of the sanctuary. First the tabernacle and later the temple. I will just take two passages to remind us and to show us this. First, let's turn to 1 Kings 6:29. "Then he carved all the walls of the house round about with carved engravings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers," and so forth. Okay, there's one other passage I'd like to read, and that is from 2 Chronicles 3:14. "He made the veil of violet, purple, crimson, and fine linen, and he worked cherubim on it." So why did I pick these two verses? Well, they simply show us that the cherubim were on the walls of the sanctuary, as well as on the veil separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary. So again, associated with the very presence of God himself, the cherubim occur. They are also the two spiritual beings represented on the Ark of the Covenant within the Holy of Holies. So let me summarize some of the things we've seen about the cherubim in the Old Testament. The cherubim are located at the very presence of God himself. They serve as guards to the utter holiness of God himself. And they keep anything unworthy of entering. They serve the Lord of hosts in his presence, and they accompany him as guards and servants. And thus they remind us of the impossibility for any human being to enter God's holy presence. They will not let us in, for we are unworthy. We are unclean and full of sin. The cherubim maintain the separation between us and God intact. They do not bridge it for us. Only God himself could do that, and he did so in Jesus Christ. This is why we can enter into the holy presence of God. Now, we can enter in the presence of the one who lives among the cherubim through Jesus Christ. And this is what takes place in the heavenly throne room seen in Revelation chapter 4. In my next video, I would like to first address the seraphim as spiritual beings, and then address this heavenly throne seen in Revelation chapter 4. Therefore, subscribe to my new channel and stay tuned. If you like this video, please show this to others by clicking the like button and by leaving a comment below. God bless.